It was a time of peace, and Bermuda settled into the sleepy middle years of the 1800s. After the excitement of the American wars and emancipation, life took a more leisurely pace. But instead of enjoying a prosperous new era, Bermudians suddenly found themselves slipping into the economic doldrums. The salt trade was in sharp decline, taking with it the profits of many Bermudian families. Worse still, the shipbuilding industry, which had made Bermuda the envy of the world, was under threat from a bold newcomer, steam power. Early steam engines had long been used in European and American mines and factories. As the Industrial Revolution gained pace, they were also being adapted for use at sea.
Its vessels had to have a wide radius of action. They also had to carry a large number of guns. And remember, at this time, there wasn't really an effective means of propelling ships other than the side-wheeler paddle. And this was only in its infancy. Screw propellers had not really been invented yet and not properly applied to ships. And such things as duck's feet had been used. These were funny kind of oars stuck to the side of ships, and they were totally inefficient in a seaway.
But before long, British and American businessmen saw the commercial potential of steam. For Bermuda, this was a disaster in the making. Gradually, local shipyards began to close as steamships from Europe and North America took over the trade routes. Bermudians also faced a crisis ashore, although many failed to recognize it. The problem was food production. There was simply not enough to go around.
I did not once encounter a piece of meat fit to be eaten, excepting when I dined on rations supplied by the convict establishment. English people whom I met declared that they were unable to get anything to eat. The people, both white and black, seemed to be only half awake. The land is only half cultivated, and hardly half is tilled of that which might be tilled. Anthony Trollope.
In those unhurried days, not many had even seen the problem coming. The problem had to be addressed quickly, and it was tackled in a determined manner by an energetic new governor, William Reed. Reed was a man of many talents. He oversaw the building of the revolutionary Gibbs Hill Lighthouse, erected from dozens of precast panels shipped from England, and he was a world authority on hurricanes. But his greatest challenge was coaxing Bermudians to switch their maritime efforts to feeding themselves. Reed was dismayed when he arrived in 1839 to find a population of 11,000 whose agricultural system was in a shambles. Most urgently, the island needed skilled farm workers, people who knew how to turn a profit from the land. Reed convinced the island legislature to fund workers from Britain, and when those workers weren't enough, he turned to the Portuguese farmers of Madeira. First to arrive were 58 Madeirans on the Bermudian ship Golden Rule, which made landfall in 1849. They quickly established themselves as skilled and willing workers and played no small part in revitalizing Bermuda's agriculture. By the 1860s, more Portuguese were following their footsteps from the Cape Verde Islands and the Azores. These were the beginnings of the vibrant Portuguese community in Bermuda, which today makes up about 15% of the population. The influx of skilled farm workers was a huge success. Bermudians found they could make good money exporting crops like onions, which led to the Bermudian onion nickname. In later years, Bermuda lilies were much prized overseas as well as at home, and still decorate island homes each Easter time. April 12, 1861. Peace was shattered as the United States plunged into civil war. On the sidelines was the tiny island of Bermuda, officially a non-combatant, but nevertheless to play a major role in the struggle between the Northern Union and the Southern Confederate States. Anxious to quickly choke the rebels, Union President Abraham Lincoln ordered a massive naval blockade of southern ports. Britain and its colony Bermuda were officially neutral, but in truth the British strongly favored the rebel South, which provided cotton as the raw material for their profitable textile mills. For Bermuda, the war was more personal. Many Bermudians had relatives in the South, and trade had always been brisk between southern ports and the island. Now they found themselves perfectly placed as a staging post for a daring group of seafarers, the Blockade Runners. Supplies for the rebels were brought into Bermuda from Europe, then transferred to smaller ships that made the fast run to Confederate ports like Wilmington, always hoping to elude the line of Union warships blocking their path. The Blockade Runners commissioned specially built ships, fast, sleek paddle-wheel vessels with shallow drafts to help them slip across the sandbars off the Confederate coast. Many were designed with collapsible smokestacks to make them less visible. All were camouflaged and made desperate dashes to port on moonless nights. Once safely ashore, the runners exchanged their cargoes for cotton, so valuable it became known as white gold, and prepared for the dangerous run back to Bermuda. Many people made their fortunes, and predictably, Bermuda was at the forefront. 35 years earlier, Hamilton had become the new capital of Bermuda, taking over the role from St. George's. Now the old town came into its own again. St. George's became the center of blockade running activity, and was soon transformed into a hurly-burly boomtown. Local businesses made small fortunes supplying everything the newcomers needed, from food and lodging to supplies and ferrymen. Bermudian pilots were in great demand to guide the blockade runners through the dangerous necklace of reefs. Local craftsmen offered their skills, and Bermuda sailors signed on as crew, even if it meant ending up as prisoners of war in Union prisons, as often happened. The first Bermudian to cash in was shipping agent John Torrey Bourne, who leased Penno's Wharf and began warehousing cargoes destined for Wilmington. A huge assortment of goods passed through St. George's on its way to the rebels. Gunpowder, ammunition, rifles, swords, uniforms, boots, saddles, blankets, medicine, and tons of food were shipped. Bourne and other agents even found room in their cargoes for luxury goods that could be sold for exorbitant prices in Confederate cities. Eventually, the Confederate government decided to send its own agent to Bermuda to take charge. Major Norman Stewart Walker arrived late in 1862 and set up Confederate operations at the Globe Hotel in St. George's. A few months later, he was joined by his wife Georgiana and their 3 children, who themselves braved the risky voyage through the blockade to reach Bermuda. The Walkers quickly became favorites with Bermudian society, entertaining prominent locals and visiting Confederates alike.
My Christmas party included most of the Confederate citizens in the island, and they number now about 100. Of course, there were many among them who scarcely expected to be invited, but I felt that all had a right, at least on this night to come. I wanted to feel that no respectable countryman of mine could say there was no one to wish him Merry Christmas, and in whose house he could break bread. Georgiana Goldson Walker.
There was less of a welcome for the unfortunate United States Consul, Charles Allen. Surrounded by rebel sympathizers, the Union representative had an impossible task as he tried to remind Bermudians of their supposed neutrality. For almost 5 years, it seemed as if the whole island was against him.
The present state of things makes it very unpleasant for me here just now, as there is a very bitter feeling against everything and everybody belonging to the United States, and many here seem to go on the supposition that I am responsible for the whole difficulty. I have learned to keep quiet and enter into no arguments. Every hole and corner is filled with Southerners. Charles Maxwell Allen.
With prosperity came lawlessness. Like any frontier town, St. George's was transformed from a sleepy bywater into a seething, rough-and-tumble outpost. Confederate crews and stranded Union sailors prowled the countless drinking dens of the old town, and violence often flared.
The constant presence of some hundreds of rollicking blades is a disgrace to any civilized community. The Royal Gazette.
The Civil War brought Bermuda its first tourist boom. No one called it a tourist boom, but that's in fact what it was. The sailors off the blockade running ships came ashore after a perilous journey with money and a desire to spend it. And spend it they did in St. George's, so that when the ships were in, St. George's was, by most standards, not a pleasant place to be. It was a bawdy place to be. There were drunks in the street, there were women satisfying their demands, we might say. And the papers, the Royal Gazette, were full of editorials about what was happening to the standard of life in Bermuda. This ended, of course, as soon as the blockade ended.
The army garrison was frequently called out to quell trouble, sometimes between black Bermudian workers and pro-slavery Confederate crews. Eventually, in 1865, the war ended. The reunited America was exhausted by the conflict, but Britain still feared it might turn against isolated strategic outposts like Bermuda.
Bermuda is the most important of our naval stations in the Atlantic. There is reason to believe that the desire of the Americans for its possession is in proportion to its value to this country. Colonel William F. Drummond Javois, Royal Engineers.
As it turned out, America had no stomach for more war. But just in case, Britain set about strengthening Bermuda's defenses yet again. The military began improvements so that fortifications could withstand the latest ironclad steamships bristling with powerful rifled guns.
The problem then arose, and it came into being really at the time of the American Civil War, was that the type of guns were changing. And the old cannon, which had been dominant in artillery for almost 300 years, was being replaced by rifled artillery, and cannonballs were being replaced by pointed projectiles. The fort cost a tremendous amount to build, and caused a bit of a furore in the House of Commons in England, and one MP asked whether in fact Fort Cunningham was made of gold because it was costing so much to build that it must be built that way.
Fort St. Catherine was greatly improved, as was Buildings Bay Battery near St. George's, which was later to be known as Alexandra Battery. New guns were installed with heavy iron shields to protect them. The Dockyard Keep was remodeled, and a new fort erected at Scar Hill to protect the dockyard. The Bermuda garrison was also strengthened, with Prospect Camp as its headquarters and other large facilities at St. George's, Bowes Island, and the training camp at Warwick, today the headquarters of the Bermuda Regiment. As ever, there was a shortage of workers. The convict labor system ended after the Crimean War, so towards the end of the century, it was decided to import new workers from the Caribbean. Workers were brought through St. Kitts from islands like Nevis, Anguilla, St. Eustatius, and Saba, and later others came from Jamaica. So many were needed that by 1904 there were more than 3,000 West Indians working in Bermuda. Other newcomers from the Caribbean were black members of the British West India Regiment, the colourful Bully Roosters, who were posted to Bermuda in 1901. Many workers and soldiers would later return to their island homes, but some remained and have many descendants.
When the penal system was abolished in the 1860s, we, of course, faced a labor crunch. And it's at that point that many of the ancestors of Bermudian families came up from the West Indies. These would be freed slaves, of course, after emancipation in 1834. And as the emphasis had been transferred from the West Indies to Bermuda and to Halifax, the work was at Bermuda. And many families trace their ancestry back to that period where they were brought in to finish the work begun by the convicts. And then at the turn of the century, when the dockyard was extended and new fortifications were made, and again in another round of new types of artillery, more people came up from places like St. Kitts and Nevis, St. Vincent, Saba, and many families in Bermuda today trace their becoming Bermudian to that period.
The major pull factor was the Dockyard Extension Works project undertaken by the Walker Company in Bermuda. That attracted a large number of laborers, some of them coming through the Panama Canal to work at the dockyard. This was significant in that it attracted mostly people from St. Kitts, from the Leeward Group, the Leeward Presidencies, and to some lesser extent, Jamaica. Post-1906, West Indians moved from moving into Bermuda to moving into Bermuda and settling. And many of the communities they established, they began to buy their own homes and began to form almost integrated communities, which almost like little towns in Bermuda. There were two areas which were the focus of this particular colonization activity. One was Somerset, the other was around Parsons Road in Pembroke. From that point forward, they would provide the bulk of the West Indian settlers.
Among Bermudian blacks, many had made great strides since emancipation. An historic day came in 1883 when the first black was elected to the House of Assembly, William Joel, who became member for Pembroke. Others found success in professions and trades once monopolized by whites. Blacks became successful merchants and doctors, published a black newspaper, the Times and Advocate, became ministers in many churches, and were highly successful as teachers, some of them from the Caribbean black community.
Perhaps in my opinion, most significant effect that the West Indian migration had was educationally. The provision of principals and teachers which educated a large portion of Bermuda's population. It is significant that at one particular school, the Berkeley Institute, up until the 1950s, there were nothing but West Indian principals.
Also in the late 1800s, tourism started to grow in Bermuda. In the early 19th century, there was little concept of Bermuda as a place for leisure or relaxation. Other than colonists, arrivals in Bermuda were trading seafarers or military personnel, who often resented being forced to live in what they considered an uncivilized and yellow fever-ridden backwater. If not openly hostile to Bermuda, others were at least bored by it.
Bermuda is a quiet land where I have heard people ask, "Did you hear the dog barking yesterday?" 2 carriages in St. George's on the same day would be an exceptional event. J.W. Bodham, Wetham.
I told the Bermudians today at the dinner table, they need have no fears, as America would not have such a godforsaken place as this if they could get it for nothing. Charles Maxwell Allen.
But gradually attitudes began to change. Residents and an increasing number of influential writers passing through the colony began to take notice of Bermuda's charms.
What a perfect vision of beauty it seemed to my wearied heart. I thought I had never seen so lovely a spot. Georgiana Golson Walker.
Such a place, such a people. Barren and secluded as Bermuda is, I think it a paradise to any spot in America I have yet seen. Tom Moore.
Until the late 19th century, Bermuda had a remarkably negative impression in the minds of most foreigners. This was an image perpetrated by British military officers who reported that this was a place of humidity, disease, yellow fever, typhoid. This was a place of shipwrecks. Shakespeare had sowed that seed many centuries before. Generally, it was a place to be avoided. But in the late 19th century, that began to change. And what changed that was the combination of the growing affluence of North America. Americans became urbanized, industrialized, and wealthy. And the richest of them began to look for places to retreat from the material progress they had, to retreat into the kind of rural, idyllic society that they thought society ought to have been.
Famous painters like Winslow Homer began visiting and were captivated by Bermuda's light and blue-tinged shadows. They showed their work in galleries across America, unintentionally promoting a previously unseen image of tranquil islands. The American humorist Mark Twain stopped in Bermuda on his way to California and was entranced, so much so that he visited as often as possible.
A few days among the breezy groves, the flower gardens, the coral caves, and the lovely vistas of blue water restored the energies dulled by long drowsing on the ocean. Mark Twain.
A trickle of others came to Bermuda, hoping its climate would be good for their health.
With the realization in North America that Bermuda was warm in the winter, North Americans in the late 19th century began to think of Bermuda as a place to go not only for recreation, but for rehabilitation. So you had the invalid trade as really the first form of tourism here. People with tuberculosis, people with respiratory diseases, and people who simply wanted to avoid the winter because it was bad for their health. They came to Bermuda to relax, to regain their health, and that was given an added boost by the fact of the American Civil War. The Civil War cut Northern Americans off from the South, the kind of gone with the wind country where they liked to go, and they looked for new destinations, and Bermuda was one of them. Now, there was a problem in this, as many of them discovered, that while Bermuda was warm in the winter, it was also humid, had that nasty north wind, and in fact, it wasn't really a good place to come and convalesce. As many of the tombstones in the churchyards in Bermuda will attest, many of them came here and never went home again, or if they went home in a box.
Other early visitors included geologists and natural scientists. Governor Henry Lefroy experimented with Bermuda's plants and soil and began lobbying for Bermuda as a tourist destination.
Over 50,000 American travelers seek the soft air of Florida every winter. I have never met one who had seen both places and that did not prefer Bermuda. Is it not worthwhile to attract some of them to St. George's? Governor Henry Lefroy.
A landmark event in promoting Bermuda came with the 1883 visit by Queen Victoria's daughter, Princess Louise. The artist princess spent a winter staying at a private home and filled her days creating watercolors of the island. Foreign newspaper reporters covering her visit were also impressed by Bermuda, and their stories further helped promote the island.
The people of Bermuda are too modest. If they pushed their claims further and made people in the United States understand what a delightful country they have, they would have far more visitors. The New York Times.
Almost immediately, there was a surge in American visitors. Bermudian businessmen finally took notice and took action. A grand new hotel was opened, shrewdly named the Princess Hotel, adding to the already built Hamilton Hotel. All over the island, small businesses sprang up, catering to the new visitors, with excursions to sites like Walsingham Cave and Devil's Hole. Next on the list was improved transport to get tourists to the island. The Quebec and Gulfport Steamship Company began providing a weekly service and aggressively promoting Bermuda in New York City through leaflet campaigns. By 1904, Bermudian, the first liner built specifically for the Bermuda run, was in service, and the island's tourism boom was becoming reality. It couldn't have come at a better time. The once prosperous tomato and onion industries were being undercut by cheaper products from California and Florida. Exports collapsed, and Bermuda needed tourism to fill the void.
We depend a great deal upon the American tourists. They say that the people in Florida live on fish during the summer months and on Yankees in the wintertime. And they might say that the people in Hamilton live on farmers during the spring and on the Americans during the winter. Nathaniel Vesey.
In 1913, the Bermuda government created the Trade Development Board, which decided to target the so-called better class of well-heeled visitor. A decision was made. Bermuda would be promoted as the Isles of Rest, an island paradise devoid of stressful factories, railroads, trolley cars, and automobiles.
It was the merchants of the Trade Development Board who had the imagination and, one has to say, the self-interest to go abroad and find the tourists. And in the 1920s, they put in place the blueprint of modern Bermuda tourism. And one has to say that they did it with great verve and imagination. One also has to say they did it in a Bermuda society that wasn't particularly democratic, where they clearly held the power in the assembly. That said, they showed this great imagination. They advertised in the right places, the high-quality American magazines like Golf and Yachting. They wanted the best kind of American tourists to come here, would spend, add to the decorum of the place, and create this new economic staple.
Within a year, the board had produced its first booklet, Bermuda's first official guidebook. Nature's Fairyland created a persuasive image of a restful Bermuda far from the madding crowd of American cities. To make sure the reality matched the promise, laws were passed to keep Bermuda beautiful. No billboards or garish advertisements were allowed. Motor cars, just beginning to appear on Bermuda's streets, were banned. The strategy worked perfectly. Visitors began arriving in droves. Not all visitors to Bermuda were voluntary. In 1901 and 2, the last 2 years of the Boer War, more than 4,000 South African men and boys were held as prisoners of war on the islands of the Great Sound. The POWs, as young as 6 years and as old as 80, were kept under heavy guard by British troops. Unlike internment camps in South Africa, which were rife with disease, the Bermudian camps appear to have been well run and peaceful. The interned children were given schooling, and the older men spent hours carving ornaments and mementos from cedar wood, which were sold for them by relief associations. An even greater war was about to engulf the world. In 1914, Britain and Germany began a conflict that would involve almost every nation on Earth. Bermudians were in the thick of the fighting in Europe. 250 members of the Black Bermuda Militia Artillery worked in munitions dumps near the front lines in France. 122 men of the Bermuda Volunteer Rifle Corps joined the Lincolnshire Regiment and saw action in the trenches. 40 Bermudians, all from the BVRC, were killed. Far away from the trenches, Bermuda itself saw little effect from the war other than disrupted shipping. And once again, a few prisoners of war and several German citizens were interned on Ports Island. In 1918, the war ended, and a stunned world began picking up the pieces. Bermudian soldiers headed home. But would it be to an island fit for heroes?